Bueno, muy puntualmente, incluso con un minuto de antelación, voy a presentar a la primera ponente, la Patricia Popelier, una académica de gran prestigio internacional. Patricia Popelier es catedrática de Derecho Constitucional en la Universidad de Antwerp, es decir, lo que nosotros llamamos Amberes. Es una académica de reconocido prestigio, especialmente en el ámbito de los estudios de federalismo, y ha publicado y ha dirigido trabajos que son trabajos de referencia académica internacional. Hay un trabajo que dirigió ella, colectivo, que puede ser de especial interés en nuestro país, sobre las asimetrías en los sistemas federales, y entre sus muchísimos trabajos, sobre todo hay uno que quiero resaltar, del año 2021, es decir, muy reciente, y seguro que va a hacer muchas referencias a cuestiones que la profesora Popelier aporta en ese trabajo, y es Federal Dynamics, a New Theory of Regional Authority of Cohesion, publicado, como digo, en 2021, en el que abre importantes perspectivas teóricas en el estudio de los sistemas federales y en la forma de afrontar los sistemas políticos federales en sus diferentes vertientes. No voy a alargarme más, simplemente dar la palabra a la profesora Popelier. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for speaking English. In Spanish, I wouldn't last for more than 5 minutes, and even then. So I was asked to say something about the challenges of federalism after the pandemic. And let me see. And I was wondering, what exactly does that mean? So it is the challenges of federalism, not during, but after the pandemic. What can we learn? Is that the question? What can we learn about the operation of federal systems based on experience in the pandemic? Because there has been a lot of scholarship during the pandemic, no, the other way. And the main questions were, like, if you have a federal system, is it better equipped or less well equipped to deal with health crisis, and why? And actually, there are two assumptions behind that. And the first assumption is that we can discern what is a federal system from what is not a federal system. And then they will operate differently, or they are better or less able to manage a health crisis. The second assumption is that the structure of a country, the way it is organized, matters. It impacts on the effectiveness of how a pandemic is managed. So first assumption, we can discern federal systems from non-federal systems. And there is this very interesting study by Cameron looking at comparing federal systems and non-federal systems and how they did during the pandemic. And his conclusion was, oh, well, some federal systems did very well, some federal systems did not well. So I don't know what that means. But then what were the federal systems? What in his eyes are federal systems and what not? So if you look at Cameron, he says, yeah, Spain, that's a federal system. Italy and the UK, he presented as models of non-federal systems, and saying, oh, well, there it didn't go so well, but other unitary systems did perform very well. And I was thinking, okay, Spain is, Italy and the UK is not, but we have 2 edited volumes on, well, there are 3 actually, but I taking these two because they're open access and you can consult them very easily. One was edited by Steidler, and there, Spain, Italy, and the UK are considered federal systems. And the other one was by Chattopadhyay, and actually, I must pronounce this completely wrong, but anyway, actually, they decided to include Cameron's paper, which was first published elsewhere. But in that book, Spain and Italy are considered federal. The UK is not in the book, so I don't know what they think about it. But so you see, there is a difference of understanding, at least, and also, is Spain a federal system? I'm teaching comparative federalism in my hometown in Antwerp for international students. It's an English a master's. And if I start with these questions all the time, I give a lot of flags and I ask, okay, is this a federal system? Is this a federal system? And when it's Spain, most students that are Spanish, they say, no, not at all, not a chance. And yet, in a lot of studies, Spain is considered a federal system. Some say no, some say yes, others say, well, it is kind of, it's a federal system with adjectives, it is a quasi-federal system, it is an immature federal system, they have all these sort of adjectives. And that is actually against which someone has reacted. Now, if we look at the Constitution, it talks about unity of the Spanish nation. But, you know, if you look at Australian preamble, you see the same thing. If you look at the US Constitution and the preamble, it doesn't say it's a federal system either. It's all coming together. And the Spanish Constitution also talks about autonomy and different regions and solidarity. So, yeah. This is Gemma Sala, who published a paper in Popelier saying, enough with this discussion. Spain is a federal system. I'll show you. So she says a federal system, to define that, you have to look at the institutions, at the features, institutional features. And if it has these institutional features, then it is a federal system. And then the question is, which institutional features do you pick? Now, there are several lists in the literature, and you can just pick and choose. She looked at Riker, and she only picked a few institutional features, applied it to Spain, and said, yeah, we're a federal system. Others have longer lists. You see, Anna Gamper made a list. Actually, she had fewer, but then if you look, read the paper, there are some institutional features within these categories. So that's a list. And then Ronald Watts, very influential, had a list. And then Swendon, he took that same list, but then added 2 features, saying it has to be a democracy, and you can't have secession rights. So Ethiopia, no. So yeah, it's a bit cherry picking, right? Which institutional features you choose. So what are the problems with this approach? Saying you need these kind of institutional features. If you have it, you're a federation or even a federal system at large. If you don't have it, you are not. You are aspiring quasi. So that's a cherry picking problem. There's also a circular reasoning fallacy, because if you say that you need these institutional features, it means that already in your head, you have an idea of what a federal system is. And what the method is that, and Anna Gamper has explained it very well in her paper, you select model federations. These model federations, the US, in essence, and then you can add a few like Germany, and but that's the biased selection of model federations. Actually, to become a federation is to become the US. That's what it comes down to. And this has a lack of universal validity, because if you look at these model federations, most of the times they are all coming together federations, last century federations, so old models that are coming together that are also homogeneous. Like Germany, Austria, and the US, they all have a very strong nationality and sense of belonging. Whereas if you have multinational systems, and this is what we see in this century, multinational systems that are fragmenting, that are falling apart. These systems are completely different in their operation. They have specific institutional features, like many of them have something that you will never see in homogeneous federal system, which is asymmetry. Some units that have more autonomy than others. At the same time, if you don't look like the US, well, you're not a real, genuine, mature federation. You see, these adjectives, they give a sense of superiority. These other systems, they aspire to be a federation. They're not yet there. But most of the times, they don't even want to. You see, a lot of these kind of systems have what I show you in the Spanish Constitution, this sense of unity, which is threatened. So you need to emphasize that. And you need to make sure that in the whole system, you keep that. So yeah, you end up with these federal systems with adjectives, which are kind of hybrids, intermediate constructs. And there is the embarrassment of intermediate constructs, because at this time, we have so many of them. The European Union, Italy, the UK, very different hybrids, which are all so different from each other that they're not really one category that you can scientifically analyze as one system. So scientifically, it doesn't mean anything. There's a denial of political reality, because what the specific features are, that's just part of a political bargain. For example, whether you have a constitution for the regional units, well, depends on the bargaining, depends on whether they had it already pre-existent or not. Just political bargain. There's a risk of missing out. Sometimes you will miss features that are very important for the functioning of a federal system. For example, in all theory, everyone is so much fixated on upper chambers. Upper chambers, this is where the regional units, the subnational units are represented. Well, in theory, yeah, but in practice, not really, and sometimes much more effectively in other places. But as long as you're fixated on this upper chambers only, you miss out. And it's always about the relation between these federated entities and the central federal government. Whereas actually, nowadays, everything is much more complex. Local entities get more and more autonomy. We have the European Union, which is also a level with a lot of autonomy. And the dynamics between all these levels, that is what makes a federal system even more interesting. So I have a problem with a narrow approach, but there's also a broad approach. We find it with El-Azhar. who says federalism is actually a combination of self-rule and shared rule. Now, there is some discussion in the literature about what shared rule means. So self-rule, we understand that. That is the autonomy that the subnational entities have to make their own rulings. Shared rule, some see this as where the subnational entities are involved in the central decision-making process so that they can make sure that their interests are protected. So it's also about autonomy, making sure that your own interests are protected in that central decision-making. Others interpret shared rule, and Elazar is very confusing about what he means exactly, but some say, no, with shared rule, he means this is the self-rule of the central government. So you have to make sure that the central government has some exclusive competences for itself. And this is because the US was coming together, so you had to give the central government something. Now, this in itself is over-inclusive. Like all these hybrids that I told you about, as well as the traditional federations, they're all a combination of self-rule and shared rule. That means that you have no differentiation between very different types, and that it's very difficult to say something intelligible about federal systems and whether, for example, they're better equipped or not to handle a pandemic, because they're so different. There's only a focus on autonomy, and I'll go further on that in a moment. It also means that if something changes in the system, for example, my own country, Belgium, started as a unitary state, decentralized with local entities, then gave regional autonomy and a bit more and a bit more, and then turned into a federal system, and actually is also called a confederal system nowadays. But it's all a combination of self-rule and shared rule. So yeah, in a way it stays the same, although it actually changes radically. So, and actually Elazar understood that it's too broad. So he then made these classifications within these federal systems. Says there's a federal system, but then you also have federations and other types, as types of federal systems. But the way that he classified it had nothing to do with the essence of federalism. It was a bit random, so difficult to use as well. But we have to understand that. So there is federalism as a principle. We have federal systems, which are actually multi-tiered systems. So systems with a distribution of competences to territory-based entities. And then you have different types, and a federation is just one type of federal system. So sometimes it's easier to just say multi-tiered systems instead of federal systems to avoid confusion. And also because for many people, the word federal is like horrifying. European Union scholars don't tell them European Union is a federal system because that's the F word. It was for the UK, perhaps also in Spain. Okay, so what is then the federalism as a principle? And the way I see it is that it is a balance, not between self-rule and shared rule, but between something that is linked with it, that is close to it, but not quite the same. It is a balance between cohesion and autonomy. And what that balance is, it can be this or this or this. What it is a political agreement. And then you put that in the constitution. But it is always contested. So it's dynamic, it changes, informal or formal, through constitutional amendment or otherwise. And that means that we can see 9 different types of federal systems. depending on how much cohesion or how much autonomy is in the institutional system. And then you see that even the traditional federations are very different. Like the US, that would be something with a lot of autonomy, but not so much cohesion. So more something like a confederation. Whereas Germany would be something with medium or high autonomy, but also high cohesion. So they're more on top. Austria would be more centralized. So even they are very different and therefore difficult to compare. Okay. So how do we measure that? How do we situate these systems? I develop indicators to do that, looking at status, at powers, fiscal arrangements, and looking at how much autonomy does it give, and how much cohesion. And cohesion is, do I have something about that? No. Cohesion is not so much, it's not the same as centralization, because that's the opposite of autonomy. Cohesion is more about deciding together, not just for to protect your own interests, but also taking account of the others and of the general interest. For example, it is much more cohesive to decide with a collective veto in an upper chamber than to give individual veto rights to one individual entity or each entity apart. It's also about solidarity, solidarity system, for example, fiscal equalization. It's also about making a public space for everyone, recognizing differences, but also creating some sense of belonging. I applied that to Belgium. Turns out that Belgium is actually a confederation for most systems, but we are an asymmetric system as well. So if you look at it from the perspective of the German community, then it's only a regionalized system. So a system can be different things at the same time. That's the complexity of the systems nowadays. So yeah, Spain, Italy, and the UK, in my view, are federal systems. They're not necessarily federations. We'll have to measure to know for sure. But also the model federations are very different. It means that in this theory, you can have EU member states, you can have the states, provinces, länder, but also regions, even local entities. They all fit in that scheme. And then the question is, what determines the choice of the federal balance? I have no time to go deep into that, but I just want to say it is not the case that you have to have a specific balance to be like, this is the model, this is what you should have. It all depends on all kinds of things, what the political agreement will be, what you think will be the optimal measure of autonomy and of cohesion. So one federation is not the other, also when it comes to managing health crises. That is what Cameron saw, is that, yeah, non-federal countries or federal countries, you can find them all across the performance scale. And of course, there are also contextual factors that matter. What's the size of the country? Where is it located? What's the demography? It's much easier for Australia to handle it than for a very small country as Belgium, where you drive for 3 hours and you're in a different country already. Also, yeah, even if you just look at what is the impact of federal system, the type of federal system matters. Who is competent for which policy domain? Is it very fragmented? And also cohesion. How are the levels of authority aligned? Is it easy for them to work together? Are they opposed or not? So it also means that if you look at what is the impact of federal systems, you can look at any system, and you don't have to look just at these two levels, because the local entities also played a very important role in the crisis. And there was even a role for the European Union. So it's really a multi-level system. So what does the literature say? Assumption 2, the structure of a federal system impacts on the effectiveness. So if we read the literature, when did federal system perform well during the pandemic? Well, if you already had a decent national public health and medical care system, that helped a lot. Also, what was the attitude of the public? Did they accept that this was a threat and it was serious, so they were willing to apply the rules? And political leadership, what did they do? I mean, the United States and Brazil, two federal countries, but federal leadership completely failed. And then do you act on that basis with a scientific understanding, using scientific experts? All that was crucial. Yeah. But if letting that alone, does the federal structure as such also affect that? What we see is first, what is the propositions that were made was that federal systems are better because they allowed for tailored responses. They also allow to experiment with innovative approaches, and state governments can step in if central leadership falls short. And let's start with that, the last one. We saw that in the USA, in Brazil and India, where indeed the states stepped in. At the same time, what we saw is that as a result, the country performed better than it would have if the states had not stepped in. At the same time, there is not a full compensation because the states did not always have the competences or the capacity to do what was needed. So it is not ideal. Yeah. Experimentations with innovative approaches, examples are given. There are in Germany, in Australia, there were examples where one state would or land would do something, and then the others looked at it and said, "Oh yeah, okay, that's a good approach, and we do it as well." But that of course means that this is a federal system where the states have these competences, so where it is not the central government that decides, because you have those federal systems as well. And it is also possible beyond the federal context. You don't need a federal system for that. You can also look abroad what people are doing, what governments are doing. In Belgium, for example, schools closed very early. Why? Because the French-speaking politicians wanted that. Why? Because France did that, and they look at France. So that was in the negotiations. Yeah, no, we have to close the schools. Do federal systems allow for tailored responses? Well, what was needed during the pandemic? This is what we see from a comparison with all the reports that we've had. What was needed was that you have to be able to switch between levels. Sometimes you need a central response, sometimes it needs to be more tailored. So if you can switch, then that is better. Of course, you can only switch if all the levels have the competences and the capacity to do that. What we also saw is that intergovernmental relations were very important. Systems with good intergovernmental relations perform better than federal systems where this was a problem. And then also citizens' trust is important. For that switch, what we see is that in the first phase, there was a lot of centralization. And in the second phase, subnational entities entered stage. But also that local governments had an important role. And I think that is very important to keep in mind, to give them a better position and to also at least consult them more. for competence, you either needed a shared rule so that a central government could step in when needed, or an emergency clause. And sometimes what you saw, like, for example, in my country, is that there was no legal basis for the central government to step in, but they did it anyway, and no one complained. And there were capacity problems. This was especially so in developing federal systems, where especially the subnational entities did not have the capacity to do that. Intergovernmental relations, what we saw is that, what I just said, strong collaboration gave better performance. Every system did more intergovernmental activity, had more intergovernmental activity than before. But if you were not used to do that, it was kind of problematic. What we also saw is that, and this is a legitimate Horizon project that we are doing, the Antwerp Work Package. We just did a survey on trust in 6 different countries, Spain included. And what we saw was that, I forgot a third one on citizens' trust, that these systems, where when the trust of the citizens in a specific level of government is low, it gets higher if that same government was collaborating with the other levels. So even for trust, it is important to work together. And the other side, if trust is already high, they don't want you especially to consult others or to work together, because that might cause problems or delays and might be less efficient. So that is also something that has to be kept in mind. Okay, so the ideal design of a federal system to cope with this kind of crisis is high autonomy, but also high cohesion. That would be the ideal. I don't think there are that many federal systems that work that way, but that would be something, of course. Oh, yes, that's the slide that I was looking for. Anyway, I changed. What is happening? Okay. This is going wild. Anyway, I was at the end of my my presentation anyway, so I don't know if I have time for questions. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. As usual, your presentation has been really interesting and challenging for us. Thank you again.